Welcome and thank you for stopping by Sheila's Audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All stories on this recording are in the public domain per United States copyright law. These stories were first published around April 1910. They are about Lord Lister called John C. Raffles, the most brilliant among all thieves. He is the terror of usurers and moneylenders, robs them of their possessions by his wiles, protecting beleaguered innocence and supporting the needy. Man of honor in all respects. He persuaded that many abuses, protected by law, continue to proliferate with impunity. Every effort is made to apprehend Lord Lister, called John C. Raffles, the most brilliant of thieves. Reward, £1,000 sterling. Lord Lister: The Legacy of Eaglestone. By Kurt Matthewy. Chapter 1. The Suicide. Battersea Park stretches out in southwest London. On the north it reaches to the Thames, while on the other three sides it is bounded by streets. About a fifth of the park is occupied by the pond on the northeast side. It was about 10 o'clock in the evening. Few sounds penetrated the park from the noise of the surrounding streets, which with its rustling treetops seemed like an oasis in the bustling city bustle. On a narrow path that wound along the pond two gentlemen walked. Apparently both were absorbed in their conversation. Wrapped in roomy, dark coats, they walked on arm in arm. The larger of the pair once laughed loudly. Some thought seemed to have aroused his merriment. He stopped for a moment and lit another cigarette. Then he started. "Charlie, I'd have paid a lot of money if I'd seen Baxter's face at our last affair." The other shook his head. "I don't know, Edward, but I believe you have meddled in things that put us in serious trouble." The pair continued to walk through the quiet Battersea Park. A man huddled on a lonely bench, his elbow resting on the knee, his head propped up in his hand. He stared ahead into the water of the pond, over which a pale grey mist had settled. He sat there motionless. He had been sitting there for well over an hour when a deep sigh escaped his chest. He stood up laboriously now, stretching out his arms. He whispered softly. "No way out, none. It must." He had pulled out a length of rope and was now going to fasten it to a sturdy tree branch with trembling fingers. When this was done, he made a snare in the hanging part, climbed up on the bench, and put it about his neck. Then he sprang down, and a moment later he was floating freely between heaven and earth. The weight of the body had drawn the snare, a gurgling sound escaped his mouth and slowly he lost consciousness. The two gentlemen had moved on, reasoning vigorously. At a bend of a footpath, one of them said, "Look, Edward, we don't seem to be alone here. Someone is moving there." He pointed ahead with an outstretched hand. "Hello, Charlie. I believe there is something for us to do there. Soon." The gentlemen ran as fast as they could to the place where the weary of life was trying to put an end to his life. "Look, Edward," cried the younger, shuddering, casting the light of his electric flashlight on the body. His friend had surveyed the whole situation with a single glance, took out his knife and cut off the weary of life. Charlie held onto the body of the suicide bomber to keep it from falling. When the rescuer had cut the noose, a deep sigh escaped the lips of the unconscious. Both friends now labored diligently to recall the vital spirits into the inanimate body, and their efforts were soon rewarded. A soft, but steady breathing was heard, and soon the stranger opened his eyes. Involuntarily he felt at his neck, as if to convince himself that there was no longer any noose. The gentleman knelt beside the unfortunate man, and Charlie lit his face with the flashlight. The stranger counted about 50 years. The hair on the head was slightly grey at the temples. In the tanned but sunken face a pair of lively, sensible eyes tingled. The nose was nicely curved, around the mouth and eyes lay deep wrinkles, which indicated many worries and disappointments. The man had a muscular build. When the stranger had raised his eyes, he looked about him for a moment with staring eyes. Soon, however, he understood his condition, and his gaze seemed to ask his rescuers, "Why did you rescue me from oblivion?" The Lord, who had cut off the suicide, now bent down to him and said, "We don't know what drove you to that unfortunate step. When the need is greatest, rescue is near. But tell us, where can we take you now? Do you have any relatives? The unfortunate still looked confused at his rescuers. I don't know whether I should thank you, he began at last, for what you have done for me. In any case, I thank you for the compassion you have shown for the unfortunate. I have no one and nothing more, I am alone in the world. The first speaker now spoke again. Well, my dear friend, if no one is waiting for you, you may as well let us enjoy your company. Come along. We want to find a cafe where it is more fun than here in the cool nighttime. He took the arm of the opposing man and dragged him with him. Chapter 2. Fate. At the corner of King's Road the three walkers found a small room, which was not crowded at this time. The greater of the two gentlemen, who had found the unfortunate, ordered a sumptuous supper and hot drinks for the three. The unknown was, as it were, without will. He was cared for like a small child and had barely spoken a word. His eyes, however, said all the more, and they hung in gratitude to his two rescuers, who endeavored to put his unpleasant thoughts to flight by merry chatter about all possible indifferent things. When the larger of the two friends had taken off his coat, an elegant, bendy figure was seen. The face was finely carved and betrayed high intelligence. Every movement indicated that this person of about 30 years of age belonged to the highest circles. His friend was younger. A small moustache adorned his upper lip, and in the fresh face a pair of blue eyes looked good-naturedly into the world. When the three had finished supper, the older of the two friends said, "We have now somewhat strengthened the inner man, now it is time to talk further. We do not wish to impose ourselves on you, but wish to help you. So I beg you, if you are willing, to tell us something more about your person." The orator extended his hand to the stranger, who grasped it and pressed it with grateful emotion. Then he said in a deep voice, "I thank you with all my heart for the kindness you have shown me. You have the right to know something about me. I will lay my fate wholly in your hands. Thou shalt decide the rest of my life." "That is good. However, in order that you may know whom you place your trust in, I would first like to tell you who we are. I am Lord Edward Lister and that is my friend Charlie Brand." The stranger rose and bowed. "My name is Harry Lydon, and now, gentlemen, hear the tale of my fate." And he started. On the west coast of Scotland lies the county of Argyll, a rugged mountain landscape. Lord Lister nodded and spoke. "I know that neighborhood is familiar to me." "Very well," said Lydon, "then I need not bore you with the description of the landscape. About 6 hours from the capital Inverary, among rough rocks, lies Eaglestone Castle. Until the middle of the 17th century it belonged to the Scots de Campbell family, who still bear the title Earl Argyll today. When, on the 27th of May, 1661, Archibald, Earl Argyll, a friend of Cromwell's, was beheaded as a regicide, Eaglestone Castle fell to the crown. In 1680 the property passed to the Danby family. The significance of this genus in the history of England will surely be known to you. Eaglestone has remained in the possession of the Danby family to this day. Just today for 10 years, on his 65th birthday, Lord Robert Danby died. At the last words the speaker stifled a sob, and hot tears rolled from his eyes. Lord Lister laid his hand on Lydon's arm with a gesture of encouragement, and he went on more firmly. "You will be astonished, gentlemen, that I am so moved by this affair. But, Lord Robert was my father. My real name is Harry Danby, Earl of Eaglestone." Harry Danby now continued excitedly. "When I was 14 years old, my mother died. After my father had sincerely mourned the deceased for 4 years, he married Ethel Vanderford at the age of 39. She had mastered the art, my father, by taking all kinds of feminine tricks. He had always been a sincere character, and did not understand that Lady Ethel's love was only a hypocrisy, that she was only interested in his rich possessions. Barely a year after the marriage a son was born, and from that moment my stepmother did everything possible to supplant me who should one day fall for the possession. At first I understood nothing of all the cunning tricks of this cunning woman, but later her way of doing things became perfectly clear to me. It was her aim to alienate my father's heart more and more from me, and this was made the easier for her because I myself gave her the opportunity to do so. Friends had brought me into company, where the greatest pleasure of life is sought in game and betting. I soon fell into the maelstrom, and with the thought that one day I would be a rich heir, I thought nothing of money. The gold rolled through my fingers. Lady Ethel, anxious as she was for her son, on whom this otherwise unloving woman depended with all her heart, had reminded my father again and again of my wasteful way of life. Violent outbursts erupted between him and me, and he finally declared to me that he did not wish to pay any more debts from me. I had to give him my hand to become solid, and only under these conditions did he pay my debts. Lady Ethel played an unworthy game. While she constantly turned my father against me behind my back, she always pretended to be a loving mother. One day, however, the scales fell from my eyes, and I perceived with horror what a wicked woman she was. Although I had given my father my word that I would make amends, I had started playing again and had to pay a debt of 12,000 guilders within 24 hours. I dared not confess this to father, for I feared his righteous wrath. And in my great terror I turned to my stepmother. She, who had always shown herself so helpful, now also promised to help me, and my gratitude knew no bounds. I fell to my knees before her and kissed her hands. She appeared to me as a good angel and yet was indeed the blackest devil that ever walked the earth. In the evening she wanted to bring me the money. At that time a large hunting party lodged at the castle, which was to undertake a drive hunt the next morning. I waited impatiently for the moment when my stepmother would bring me the £1,000 sterling. It was getting later and later. I had remained in my room, as agreed, and puzzled over the question of where Lady Ethel was going to get the large sum from, but at last I was content with the certainty that I would soon be in possession of the required sum and pay off my debts, without father hearing of my new offence. It was already 11 o'clock when there was a soft knock at my door. I opened and my stepmother quickly pushed a wallet into my hand. She put her finger to my mouth, forcing me to silence, and quickly left. I opened the wallet and found in it, to my unspeakable joy, the round sum of £1,000. I kissed the wallet, thinking gratefully of the noble giver. Then I undressed and laid myself to rest. I had put the wallet on the bedside table. With the happy carelessness of youth I fell asleep and soon dwelt in the land of dreams. I had slept for about an hour when I was awakened by a loud noise. I raised my eyes and saw my father standing in my room with one of his friends. They had come to wake me, for the following had happened. Leiden, or rather Lord Danby, paused and covered his face with his hands. A deep sigh escaped his chest. After a short pause, Danby continued his story. At midnight, when the hunting party had gone to the bedrooms, one of the guests discovered that he was missing a wallet containing £1,000 sterling. He started cleaning his room and then went back to the dining room, where he found my father. He felt himself obliged to inform the host of what had happened, and the latter was greatly alarmed that such a thing had taken place in his house. They wanted to question the servants immediately. As the son of the house I would help the gentleman in this, and so my father came to wake me up. It is impossible to describe what just happened. When light had been brought into my bedroom, the owner immediately saw the wallet belonging to him lying on the bedside table. My father was beside himself. He wanted to attack me, to strangle me. In my fear and confusion I confessed everything, my levity, my gambling debts. I also told that my stepmother had brought me this wallet and that I had accepted it, on the assumption that Lady Ethel would help me. My father had Lady Ethel summoned at once. Trembling, I waited for her arrival, that hideous suspicion might be averted from me as soon as possible. She appeared very soon, and, I thought I was losing my mind, she denied everything. Coldly, with a sneer on her face, she told me that I must have been dreaming. She had never had any involvement with a frivolous son, much less thought of supporting him in any way or stealing a guest for him. It was shameful of me to accuse her of such a thing. My father, who could now believe nothing but that I had robbed the guest to pay my debts, and that I still wanted to shamefully suspect his wife, flew at me in unbridled rage. Suddenly he threw his hands in the air and fell to the ground. A stroke had paralyzed his right side. Harry Danby continued in a dull voice. I still see everything in front of me. Father, wrestling with death, lay on the floor. His eyes, which spoke terror, anger, and shame, were upon me. Soon he was surrounded by friends, and in the background, cool, erect, stood the woman who saw my boundless despair and smiled as only the devil can. With one last effort, father showed me the door. I was completely beside myself. I couldn't keep my thoughts together, and, as if pursued by furies, I flew out the door at night and at dawn. I ran through fields and meadows, not knowing where, until I fell exhausted at the edge of a ditch. Here a poor charcoal burner found me the next morning. He took me away and nursed me, for severe nervous fevers had seized me. When I finally got better and the crisis was over, I wrote to my father. I explained everything to him again and swore to him, by the memory of my dead mother, that I was innocent. I got no answer. I waited 3 days. Then I went to the castle. However, I was not received. The next day, however, I received a letter. My heart was beating with joyful anticipation. When I opened the envelope, some notes fell out, but no letter had been added. I was desperate. After I had calmed down somewhat, I took as much of the money as I needed for the journey to London. The rest I left to the poor charcoal burner for his careful care. I took leave of the people who had received me so lovingly and left for London. There I was boarded on a ship that was going to Australia and was dead and forgotten by my family. I hadn't brought any papers with me on my flight, so I was unable to prove my identity. All I have left is this medallion. It is a memento of my late mother, who hung it around my neck on her deathbed. At these words, Harry Danby produced a medallion and handed it to Lord Lister. It was a small oval object, showing in front the Danby family crest, a leaping lion and a deer. Above it soared an eagle with extended wings. Inside the locket were the miniature portraits of Danby's mother and father. Lord Lister showed Charlie Brand the locket and then returned it to its owner. Harry Danby now continued his story. What more can I say, sirs? When I had found work on a farm in Australia, I wrote my father again a lengthy letter, but again I received no answer. I am now convinced that my father never received my letters. That satanic woman intercepted them. If her evil plan were to succeed, my letters, which might alter father's judgment, must never come before his eyes. I, her stepson, had to be and remain dead to the family, that her own son, Arthur, might be all things. My last 30 years were terrible for me. It was as if the father's curse, so undeservedly cast upon me, had destroyed all happiness. In spite of all my efforts, I have never been able to acquire any appreciable capital. I could hardly provide for myself. I kept the name Harry Lydon, which I had taken on my flight from Europe. Later on I got to know Asia, Africa, and America, but all the effort was in vain. I returned to England 2 years ago. Here it was even worse for me. Though temptation tempted me many times, I have remained scrupulously honest to the last hour, and have committed no crime. However, seeing no way out of this misery, I wanted to put an end to my miserable existence. Then you came and called me back to this earthly vale of tears. Lord Lister seemed deeply moved by all he had heard, as did Charlie. The Lord's dark eyes glowed with wrath, and he said to his secretary, "That's for us, my boy. That woman must be punished and this unfortunate man restored." Charlie shook his friend's hand. "I fully agree with you this time, Edward, and will help with all my heart, as far as it is in my power." Harry Danby shook his head sadly at these words and said sadly, "Thank you very much for this participation, but I beg you not to waste your time and effort on me. My life is broken anyway. I no longer care about the possession of riches. My stepbrother Arthur gets to keep everything. What depresses me so much is the thought that my father has died without being convinced of my innocence." "No," said Lord Lister, "you shall not and must not speak thus. How thou wilt deal with thy innocent stepbrother thou must know, but thy innocence must be plainly proved. Is that woman still alive?" "Yes. I have made inquiries from time to time and know that she was alive for a short time." "Good. Then she must confess her guilt and restore your honor. You have never been seen again in your place of birth, and they know nothing about you. I myself, like Harry Danby, will venture into the lion's den. My friend follows me and we both will surely succeed in restoring you to your rights. Will you put your fate in my hands?" Lord Lister held out his hand across the table. Harry slammed into it and said, "You saved my life. I owe you thanks. You can do whatever you want. Then you must go to London. Here are £100 for your first expenses." Harry Danby fended it off. Lord Lister, however, said, "Take this, dear friend. When you come into possession of your rightful property, you can repay me what you borrowed. I need you to carry out my plan. You must be healthy and fresh for that. We will keep correspondence with each other, for your information may be of the utmost importance to me. Come and see me early tomorrow and tell me where you live. I think we can leave already tonight." Lord Lister gave Harry his address and asked for the small medallion. "I want to tell you something else," he said. "I called myself Lord Lister to you. That comes out. But I am still known by another name, the sound of which is anything but pleasant to my friends from Scotland Yard. I am John Raffles." Without waiting for an answer, Lord Lister and Charlie disappeared. Stunned, Harry looked after the two. The man's name was well known to him, and he knew that he made a sport of returning ill-gotten property by force back to its rightful owner. Chapter 3. The Both Friends. Inverary, the county town of Argyll, lies deep among rough, bare boulders. A little north of the capital, a small spit of land extends south. On one of the most inaccessible rocks rises an old castle, which with its pewter dominates the rugged mountain country. Proudly rise the battlements of Eaglestone. The history of Eaglestone Castle dates back to the 12th century. Since 1680, as we have already read, it had been in the possession of the Danby family, the eldest son of which was Earl of Eaglestone. Over the centuries the exterior of the castle has changed somewhat. In the earliest times the fortress consisted only of high vaults, subterranean passages, and caves cut into the hard rocks. In later times the actual castle was rebuilt on these ancient foundations, so that in fact a composition of the old castle and the new castle has arisen. However, the overall impression has in no way suffered as a result, because the newest construction is already 4 centuries old and the time, which wipes everything out, has ensured that this part also looks grey and weathered. The road leading to the castle is extremely difficult. A good pedestrian cannot travel this road in less than 5 to 6 hours. When one has reached the end of this road, one suddenly sees a fathomless abyss at his feet, which is about 9 meters wide. The gate of the castle rises on the opposite rocks. Only when the great drawbridge is lowered can one enter the interior of that invincible fortress. This is the only official entrance to the castle. There is, however, another small gate, which lies about opposite the main entrance, and leads to a narrow path that winds along the ridge of the mountain. However, this road is not used. The legend still lived in popular parlance that a subterranean passage would cut right through the rocks and end up in the graveyard of Inverary. One could get from the castle to Inverary by this road in a very short time. Some claimed that the journey took only an hour, others believed that it would take 2 or 3 hours more. In any case, this subterranean road was only spoken of by tradition, and no mortal could tell where in the cemetery of Inverary the passage would open. There was some excitement in the Scottish town today. 2 strange gentlemen had arrived at the Hotel the Queen of Scotland. To the few guests who had gathered in the common room in the afternoon, the lorry driver, at their curious questions, told them that the 2 gentlemen had come from Edinburgh by train, and in a first-class compartment. He supposed that they must be very distinguished gentlemen who probably had something to do at the castle. The 2 gentlemen had taken 2 of the principal rooms on the first floor of the hotel. The innkeeper, who had personally led them to the rooms, was about to leave with a bow when one of the guests said, "Bring us a good bottle. We would like some information from you, so bring a 3rd glass and keep us company. We can then have a nice chat," and they're immediately convinced that the wine is drinkable. The innkeeper, a small man with a rather round belly and small pig eyes, grinned contentedly and said, rubbing his hands, "It is a great honor for me, gentlemen, but you can be quite carefree, all carefree. My wines are excellent." "We'll see," replied the taller of the 2 gentlemen, taking a cigarette from his case. The innkeeper arrived helpfully with a match. "What kind of wine do you want, my lord?" "The best you have in the cellar." "You can count on that, count on that. Gentlemen will be well served, well served." The innkeeper bowed repeatedly and left. When the door was closed, the younger of the 2 friends laughed appetizingly. "What a comical fellow he is, Edward. He says everything twice." "Dear Charlie," said Raffles, "he thinks himself so interesting that he thinks he can be heard twice." Charlie opened his suitcase and took out a box, which he gave Raffles. "Convince yourself now that the wig turned out perfectly. Roman road has outdone itself." John Raffles opened the box. He took out the small medallion Harry Danby had given him and compared portrait and wig. He nodded in satisfaction. "Excellent indeed. I am sure that, with the beard, Harry himself will mistake me for his dead father. I hope that this little work of art will do us an excellent service." There was a knock. John Raffles put the wig back in the box, then exclaimed, "Inside." The door opened and the innkeeper entered with a friendly smile. He carried 3 wine glasses on a tray, and under his left arm a bottle of wine. He put the tray with the glasses on the table and held up the bottle with a triumphant gesture. "You'll be pleased, satisfied. It's the best I have, that I have." He had wiped the dust from the bottle and was now filling the 3 glasses. Raffles tasted the wine after holding the glass up to the light, and he enjoyed the delicious bouquet with pleasure. The innkeeper looked intently at the movements of his distinguished guest. And then he said triumphantly, "Now, wasn't I right?" "Not right? The wine is good, I am satisfied," replied Raffles. The trio sounded and the innkeeper said with a funny bow, "To your well-being. That it may please you for a long time in my house, may it please you." Charlie could not resist imitating the innkeeper and said with a laugh, "There's every chance for that, every chance." Lord Lister offered the innkeeper, who was a little offended at Charlie's jest, his cigarette case. Then he started. "Say, can't you give us some details about the people who live at Eaglestone?" The innkeeper scratched his head and looked at Raffles shyly. This one continued, "I would like to do something about them and let them know. We have been abroad for a long time, and are now coming from London to discuss some important matters with the inhabitants. It is always good that one is informed a little beforehand." "Ah, so, oh so, then I can help you, help you. Lord Arthur is a good lord, a good lord. Used to come here often, very often. Now that he is married, he is rarely seen, seldom more. People tell." Startled, the innkeeper stopped. Raffles filled the innkeeper's glass once more and asked, "Now, what do they say? Feel free to speak." "Oh, it's not bad, not bad. Lady Mabel must be quite quirky, quirky. Lord Arthur used to be so merry, and now. Isn't he merry now?" "No, not at all, not at all. Always sad, always sad." "And," continued Lord Lister, "what kind of lady is Lady Ethel?" When the innkeeper heard this name, he was visibly startled. He looked out the window and said as uninhibitedly as possible, "Here comes the steamer from Loch Galford. That is indeed of great interest to you, but I would rather hear about Lady Ethel." When Raffles uttered Lady Ethel's name again, it was as if the little fat man was having a shower. He said in a plaintive tone, "Ah, gentlemen, I can tell nothing about that, nothing to tell. You need only tell us what people generally say. Is Lady Ethel well?" "No, not at all, not at all. She has been sick for years." "Now, and beyond?" The innkeeper shrugged and answered nothing. Raffles understood that he was not getting any further this way. First, he stopped touching the subject and drained his glass. Then he asked if another bottle of the same brand was still available. The innkeeper replied in the affirmative and quickly disappeared to fulfill the order. When the door was closed, Raffles said with a smile, "I didn't think the man could keep quiet so well, but I'll untie his tongue." The innkeeper soon appeared with the second bottle, and Raffles now began to pour himself diligently and at the same time to reason about all sorts of indifferent things. Then Lord Lister suddenly asked, "Lady Ethel must be very pious?" That pious? A devil she is, a devil." Then he seemed to come to his senses and said, "Forgive me, gentlemen, the people at least say it. Raffles put the little man back on the chair and answered, "Come on, fellow, be sensible and tell me what the people say. You can trust us completely, we will not say a word about it." In his funny language the innkeeper now told that the old lady was hated and feared all around. It was said that she had made an alliance with the devil and could witch. The servants of the suppliers must have heard terrible cries and could tell of ghostly apparitions, of dogs, with fiery eyes, and other beasts. When the innkeeper had finished his narration, Raffles thanked him and laughed at the superstition and the silly talk. The innkeeper, however, solemnly assured that something of this story must be true. In any case, it was not clean at the castle. Raffles asked if the innkeeper had a servant who could take a letter to the castle the next morning. The innkeeper replied in the affirmative, and Raffles ordered the servant to be ready by 7 o'clock. The great unknown then ordered a lavish supper in his room, took writing implements and said to Charlie when the innkeeper had left, "And now, my dear boy, we shall announce our visit to Lady Ethel, and then venture into the lion's den tomorrow." Chapter 4. Resurrected from the dead. The tone of an electric bell rang shrilly across the room. An elderly woman rose from the armchair and went to the door. The bell rang for the second time now. Twice. "That's for you, John." The old man nodded and left the room. He was about 65 years old. His face was clean-shaven and sparse grey hair covered his skull. With a swiftness that would not have been expected of him, he climbed the steps of the spiral staircase which led to the first floor. He knocked at a low door of carved oak and entered a few moments later. In the room a lady of about 50 years old was leaning against the table. Her hair was grey, her stature tall and strikingly thin, her eyes were a glittering black and had a stinging expression. The tightly closed lips were covered by a strongly curved, narrow nose, giving the face a bird of prey expression. John had stopped in the door. The lady now turned her head and asked in a cutting sharp voice, "Who brought that letter?" "The innkeeper's son from the Queen of Scotland delivered it half an hour ago. Madam was not there, so I put the letter on the table, as usual." Lady Ethel did not answer. She threw the letter on the table with an insulted gesture and went to the window. For a few moments she looked out thoughtfully, then spoke in a curt, commanding tone. "Have Lady Mabel come here at once." John bowed silently and disappeared through a small door that led to the interior of the castle to the left of the tower room. Lady Ethel had returned to the table, picked up the letter again, and sat down in an armchair. Again she began to read word for word. The letter was short and read as follows. Lady Ethel. I have returned from my world travels to Scotland. This afternoon I will visit my father's castle, and I am already looking forward to greeting my stepbrother, who has so faithfully managed my inheritance. However, I wish to speak to you alone. A friend of mine, who knows everything, accompanied me to Inverary. I am reporting this to you so that you can take the measures you may wish to take accordingly. At 3 o'clock I come to the little gate leading to the Benhart Pass, and I wish you would have me led from there to you. Harry Danby, Earl of Eaglestone. Again and again Lady Ethel read this letter. Dark clouds covered her temples. She nodded and whispered. My dream. My dream. I saw the graves open and the dead of Eaglestone rise again. Yes, yes, the dead rise again. There was a knock and a lady entered the room. It was an apparition that attracted attention. On a medium-sized, slender figure stood a head which might have been called beautiful, had not some feature of cool calculation disfigured the face and disturbed the harmony of the noble, pure features. Golden braids crowned the forehead and whites, the full neck adorned a precious string of pearls and brilliants, while precious rings glittered on the small, slender hands. With a graceful nod she entered the room and said, Good morning, Mommy. Did you have me called? Mabel, Lord Arthur's wife, had gone to Lady Ethel, kissed her hand, and then sat down on a low chair at the old lady's feet. Lady Ethel returned her daughter-in-law's morning greeting with a slight nod. She stared thoughtfully through the window, barely perceiving the presence of the young woman. After a while Mabel said, with a mocking smile passing over her face, Well, Mama, so deep in thought? I thought you had very important things to tell me, because you had me called so hastily. Lady Ethel seemed to be startled from her thoughts as her daughter-in-law addressed her. A deep sigh escaped her breast, and she said, emphasizing every word, You refused to believe me yesterday when I claimed that our house is threatened by misfortune. I was right. Mabel smiled briefly. But Mum, I pray you, how can anyone be so superstitious? Then she replied, I know what I'm saying. I saw in my dream how the dead haunted the castle. Then a mighty black hand was raised, which swung the lightning into the lock. I saw no flames, however, only thick smoke and black smoke. The clouds grew blacker and darker, and when they had cleared the castle was gone, only Arthur sat on a stone and wept. Behind him, however, stood a bearded man, holding in his hand Eaglestone Castle, which had become ridiculously small. Lady Mabel had jumped from her seat. She turned in a circle, clapped her hands, and cried with a laugh. That must have been a nice little hand, Mama, that carried a whole mountain. Mabel. I know the dead will rise again, replied Lady Mabel, in a worried tone. Her hand seized the fatal letter, then she continued. You know that your husband's stepbrother has been missing for nearly 30 years. Yes, he was chased away by father like a thief and then perished. Lady Ethel had grown a little paler at the words of her daughter-in-law. She clutched the letter convulsively between her fingers and spoke slowly and tonelessly. Harry Danby is now in Inverary and will be here in a few hours to accept his inheritance. Lady Mabel sprang up as if stung by a viper. What, this thief, that vagabond dares to return here? She cried out in a shrill voice. Yes, my child, I just received his letter. Lady Ethel spoke again with great emphasis, and Mabel stared at her mother-in-law in a daze. Then she asked, "Do you stay so calm down there, Mama? We shall not receive that tramp, of course. That will be difficult. I think it's better if we try to get on good terms with him." "What do you say to a thief?" "Are you so sure he's a thief?" Slowly these words had passed the old lady's lips. Mabel looked at her mother-in-law in surprise. "You may come, Mama, whatever you want. In any case, I will never." Lady Ethel sharply interrupted her daughter-in-law. "You will receive him kindly, if I wish. And I want it." The old lady had raised herself high, and she looked at her daughter-in-law with an imperious gaze. Mabel shrugged. She, however, did not dare to contradict, and said only in a slightly mocking tone, "I should like to know, Mama, why you are suddenly so indulgent." "That's my business. Go now, I'm waiting for visitors. Make sure Arthur doesn't notice, and wait, both of you, until—" She was silent. Another thought seemed to flash in her mind, and after a while she went on. "Wait, until I have you called. Nor do I want you to say anything to Arthur about what I just told you. Go." Mabel peered at her mother-in-law. She was about to leave, but suddenly Lady Ethel called her back, and spoke in a wonderfully soft tone. "You're actually right, child. It might be better for us if we don't see him again. I'll think what we have to do. But make sure Arthur doesn't hear anything. Go now." Mabel bent over the hand her mother-in-law had given her as a farewell, and then left the room. Lady Ethel pressed the button of an electric bell, and a few moments later John entered. She smoothed out the letter which she had tampered with a moment before, handed him her trusted servant, and then went to the window. She looked out for minutes, then said in a half-tone, My dream, my dream. I saw the tombs open and the dead of Eaglestone haunt the castle." "It was only a dream, madam," which certainly meant nothing. Lady Ethel shrugged and went to the window. Her face twisted into a devilish smile as she whispered in a semi-loud tone, "Harry doesn't trust me. Now, we shall see who overcomes. Though I have grown 30 years older, I will still have the strength to crush you today. The dead must return to their graves. I will banish you." She turned again to John, who was still standing at the door. "John, I know you're fond of me. For decades I have tried you faithfully, and you know that I have never been ungrateful for the services rendered. I feel that I do not have much longer to live, and that is why I do not want to see my work perish anymore. I count on your tried and true faithfulness and silence." The old servant bowed to his mistress and kissed her right hand reverently. Lady Ethel continued. "So, John, you must be at the little gate leading to the pass by 3 o'clock. Then immediately bring him through the corridor on the right to here. As soon as he is here, lock the door leading to the connecting corridor from the outside, and set up the foreigner's bed." When Ethel spoke the last words an ugly grin flew across the old servant's face. "The stranger's bed will be set up. Fire or water?" "I do not know yet. Now go to your post." John bowed and left. Lady Ethel went to a cupboard and took out of it a strange little device, which she set on the table. The device was no bigger than a matchbox. The part consisted of a small pan with a disproportionately long handle. To this stem Lady Ethel screwed a mouthpiece containing innumerable fine holes. Then she took off the tight-fitting lid and shook from a box she had also taken out of the cupboard, a little of a red powder into the pan. After pouring 3 drops of a violet liquid from a vial onto the powder, she opened the window of the tower room and the door opposite. Then Lady Ethel tied a handkerchief tightly around her mouth and nose, took the plug of the electrical line which was on the apparatus, and inserted it into the opening which was fastened to the table leg. She pressed a small button, and at the same instant a cloud of smoke appeared from the openings of the device, filling the room with an intoxicating air. Lady Ethel nodded in satisfaction. The strong draught quickly dissipated the vapor, and she closed the windows and door again. Then she took the cloth that had surrounded her mouth and nose and laid it on the table beside her. She positioned the small device so that it was exactly in front of the person who was to sit on the chair close to the door. In doing so, as if by accident, she placed some magazines and newspapers over the strange device, so that an ignorant person could suspect nothing of its presence. She had just finished preparing when John came in to inform her that the stranger had come. "Is the foreigner's bed all right?" "Yes." "Let him come in." Lady Ethel stood by the table with her back to the window, so that her face was in shadow, while the full light fell upon the intruder. The door was opened and Lord Lister entered. With a quick glance he surveyed the figure of the lady and said, bowing courteously, "Milady has received my letter, as I understood from the receipt at the small gate. I am Harry Danby, Earl of Eaglestone." The lady seemed to be unpleasantly surprised at the appearance of the supposed Harry Danby. She had expected a man sorely tried by fate, a bruised one, who came to her begging, and now she saw before her a man who combined the manners of a man of the world with good manners, great willpower, and self-confidence. She pointed to the chair closest to the door, and said herself, taking her seat, "I have received the letter with your wishes expressed in it." "Thank you, my lady," said Raffles, taking his seat. "You have no reason to be thankful. A stranger comes here and claims to be Harry Danby. How will you prove that it is indeed you? Our family only knows that Harry has been gone for 30 years and is most likely dead." "Oh, no, milady," replied Lord Lister, cheerfully, "he lives and is in excellent health." He could say this with great certainty, for he had received word from Harry Danby before his departure from the hotel. "To give you certainty, milady, I want to show you something that will certainly convince you. Do you know this medallion and these portraits?" Lord Lister had taken out the medallion which the real Harry Danby had given him, and now showed it to Lady Ethel. She only glanced at it, then spoke softly. "It is indeed him." Lord Lister gloated at her fright. Finally the lady started again speaking, and in a short, sharp tone she said, "And what do you really want here?" "That is indeed a wonderful question, milady. I want to accept my inheritance." "You seem to have forgotten for what reason you had to leave the parental home 30 years ago." "Oh no, this was because a vengeful, wicked woman had lowered herself to a thief to take from me honor, name, right, and property. Now, milady, the hour of retribution has come. For 30 years I suffered innocently, but now you will not escape the just punishment." Lord Lister had sprung up. His face glowed with noble wrath. His eyes flashed lightning. Lady Ethel had cringed at the indictment, as if she had been whipped. Now she looked up at Raffles, who stood before her like a god of vengeance, and a devilish smile marred her face. She quickly grabbed the cloth which she had previously worn about her mouth and nose, and at the same time she pressed the button with her left hand. A tremendous cloud of vapor flew from the small craft in front of Lord Lister, enveloping it in an instant, and spreading an intoxicating odor throughout the room. All this happened so suddenly that Raffles had no time to think. Instinctively he pressed his handkerchief, which he held in his hand, to his mouth, but in the next instant he lost consciousness and with a dull blow he fell to the ground. The lady tore open the window. Then she sounded a signal on a silver whistle. A moment later John entered the room. He also had his nose and mouth tied up. The lady pointed to the man who lay on the floor. John pressed a spring next to the door, and soon an opening appeared in the right wall near the floor. One could now see the beginning of a steeply descending slide. At the top of this stood a sort of small sledge near an opening in the wall. John took the body of the unconscious man, carried it to the opening, and shoved it in. Then he lifted a lever and with horrifying speed the body of the unfortunate flew into the ghastly abyss. As if nothing had happened, John closed the valve in the wall and then asked his mistress, "What commands my lady, water or fire?" The lady had stood at the window with her arms folded and had watched the proceedings with cold indifference. "Water will cool the blood of that wretch the quickest. I expect to be rid of him for good now. Did you understand me?" John Bowden left the room. Chapter 5. The Place of Crime. With furious speed the sled on which lay the unconscious Lord Lister slid down the undulating track. Suddenly there was a violent jolt. The sled had struck with its front against a rather high cross-beam. This thrust freed the sled from its load, and was then hurled back by means of very cleverly arranged machinery. At this blow, of course, the body of the unfortunate had to fly forward. It tumbled twice in the air, then flew toward a fairly wide opening in the rock. One heard the sound as of water splashing, and after that everything remained dead silent. But what was that? A sloshing sound broke the silence, and suddenly a light flashed. John Raffles was on his knees, holding in his right hand his electric flashlight to look around. What he beheld was awful. The terrible sway which his body had experienced from the impact of the crossbeams had flung him to the right corner of the rocky cavern. The ground here was very steep. There was quite a lot of water there. If Raffles had landed on the rocky bottom, he would inevitably have broken some ribs, perhaps his neck. However, the water had dampened the force of the collision. It also had another good effect: the cool bed awoke the unconscious from his stupor. Since the great unknown had instinctively put his handkerchief in his mouth when the little device began its destructive effect, the stupor had not been as bad as Lady Ethel supposed. The cold water took effect, and so Raffles soon came out of his stupor and came to himself. After first taking the handkerchief from his mouth, he soon got out his electric flashlight to convince himself where he really was. He was in a room that was 10 meters square. There was no window that gave light or let in light. About 20 feet over the face of the earth saw a dark opening at one of the walls. That was the end of the slide on which he had slid so quickly from the tower room into the dreadful depths. The atmosphere in this horrific prison was suffocating, and there was a damp, horribly decomposing air. Raffles had risen from his kneeling position and was now moving slowly forward. Suddenly his foot hit an object. As he directed the light of the electric lantern there, he was dismayed to see the skeleton of a man, from which at the unusual light some rats took flight. Disgust and terror seized him. Suddenly his attention was drawn to a sustained gurgling noise. He returned to the place where he had been hurled and whence the sound had come. To his surprise he found that the water which had rendered him such great service in the fall was almost gone. A round iron valve had sunk into the depths. He now also understood why he felt a strong, stabbing pain in his feet. When he fell from above, he had hit the valve with full force with his feet, and it had opened outwards, allowing the water to run off. Raffles at once went to investigate a little more closely and discovered that this valve could be opened from below, by a chain which, guided over wheels, led into a narrow gorge of rock. Lord Lister had sat down on the stones and lit the hole behind the hatch with his lantern. To his surprise he found that there seemed to be some steps behind it. He was already about to go through the hatch to inquire when a clattering sound behind him drew his attention. He turned and was astonished to see that suddenly from 2 pipes, which he had not noticed before, jets of water were pouring. Like a bolt of lightning the thought flashed through his mind that the devil woman wanted him to drown. The water jets rolled down from the heights more and more strongly. If Raffles hadn't knocked the hatch open in his fall, the water would have climbed to man's height in 5 minutes. Now, however, it flowed downwards as quickly as it rustled from above. Raffles had retreated to a corner of the den, where he remained perfectly dry. He understood quite rightly that that waterfall would eventually stop. To pass the time, he wanted to light a cigarette, but was disappointed to find that the cigarettes had been thrown into his pencil case, and thus unusable. He threw the cigarettes on the ground, and the little white rolls were washed into the abyss by the current. His good humor soon prevailed, however, and he muttered, "If I do get that nice shower, I'll just wash myself a little." He stretched out his arms, raised his cuffs a bit and began to wash his dirty hands. After more than 3 minutes the waterfall became less and less and finally stopped completely. Lord Lister looked at his watch and saw that it was 4:30. He muttered merrily, "You will be disappointed, Lady Ethel, if you think you are free from me. No, my dear, John Raffles has a tough life. His bright star shines and soon you will have the pleasure of seeing me again. Now let us try to vacate this comfortably furnished stranger's room as soon as possible, before perhaps another surprise arrives. It is not polite at all, Lady Ethel, to give guests such a damp bed." He leaned forward again towards the hatch, looked down into the depths and found that some steps indeed led down. He took the lantern between his teeth and went into the depths. He felt solid ground, let go of his hands carefully, grabbed the lantern and lighted it around. The 3 steps led to a dark corridor which seemed to run on. The hallway was dry, so the water had to drain into the rock crevices. The air was still oppressive here, too, but Raffles did not hesitate for a moment and moved forward rapidly. After he had gone barely 20 paces, he noticed that the corridor branched out. Which way should he take now? Should he go left or right? He reasoned thus. I don't know whether I'll be more free to go straight ahead or to the left. The road on the left seems to be easier, but it goes straight down steeply. Why should man make life unpleasant if it is not absolutely necessary? So let's go to the left. And he went this way. After he had gone about 200 paces, the passage turned sharply to the right, and soon Raffles stood before a small stairway, cut into the rock, leading to an ironclad gate. Raffles looked at that door. Where would she go? He convinced himself that he had his pistol with him, took it in his hand and was just about to try to open the gate, when he realized that the pistol would certainly not be too reliable anymore. After all, his cigarettes had gotten wet. After all, his cartridges could also have become damp, so that they would refuse. This moment of hesitation was excellent for Lord Lister, for suddenly he heard voices behind the gate door. He crept into a corner and put out his lantern. The door seemed to be very thick, for though he exerted his utmost he could understand but little. He heard a deep voice speak of flames and sparks, also heard that two other voices answered, but was unable to understand the content of what was spoken. It's all right, he reflected, maybe I'll have better luck the other way. I'll find out later the secret behind this. Now I have to see the light of day again. He went back the way he had come, and was soon again at the place where the corridor forked. Walking slowly and carefully, he now realized that this corridor indeed led perpendicularly into the depths. On the right side was a sturdy iron chain, which certainly served as a support, lest one should slip on the slippery bottom. As quickly as possible Raffles tried to push forward in the passage, and suddenly he found himself facing a sheer rock face. He convinced himself that he had used about 3/4 of an hour for his descent. Then he lit the wall with his lantern. He understood that there must be an exit here somewhere. Then he began to knock against the wall, and at the very bottom a hollow sound betrayed that one of the stones was not fastened. Raffles now exerted all his strength and finally succeeded in removing the small boulder. Now he again lit the space that had now been created with the lantern. Everything was dark. He found that his condition was gradually becoming very unpleasant. Yet he crawled through the opening and then once again let the light of the lantern fall around. A shudder seized him. He was standing on a coffin. Ahead, 2 coffins stood across. He understood that he was standing in a family grave. Carefully he stepped down from the coffin and continued to search for an exit. Now he would soon be at liberty, for the door leading to the family tomb had to be easy to open. After Raffles had struggled to put the boulder back in its place, he went to the door leading to the burial vault. It opened easily and after a few minutes Raffles was again at liberty. He breathed deeply into the open air. Then he stretched to give his limbs back the old flexibility. Chapter 6. The Secret of the Coffin. Evening twilight had fallen. In the west, the sun descended in orange glow and a soft evening cool rustled through the treetops. In majestic tranquility the graveyard expanded before Raffles. His keen ear heard now approaching steps, and an instant later a well-known figure loomed. Lord Lister hardly dared to believe his eyes. It was Charlie Brand who had visited the cemetery at Inverary, hoping to discover something of the mysterious subterranean passage of which the innkeeper had told. There he suddenly found himself facing his best friend. Charlie could not find words at first when he saw Raffles, who was barely recognizable in his dirty clothes with the disheveled hair. Raffles laughed at his friend's surprise and said, "Yes, dear Charlie, that's what a man looks like now, who nearly drowned twice, and took whole tumbles through rocks." At Charlie's astonished questions, Lord Lister recounted his adventure. When he told of his involuntary prayer, Charlie insisted on going home, for his friend feared that Lister might fall ill. "Don't worry, Charlie, I feel as healthy as a fish in water. We are not going home yet. I'm glad I met you so unexpectedly. I will now first show you the entrance to the cave. One can never know what it is good for you to be oriented. Do you have your flashlight with you?" Charlie nodded in agreement. "All the better. So we have double light and will go and examine the burial vault again." The two friends went back to the vault. Raffles was the first to climb back up to the coffin that stood on the rock wall. In the sharp light Raffles noticed that a much larger stone lay on top of the smaller one, blocking the actual entrance to the vault. "I think I was mistaken, Charlie. At first I thought this entrance was half a century or more older, but now I see that the iron handles are of much more recent date. It is quite evident that human hands have regularly dealt with these handles from time to time. You may be right, Edward. Raffles had stepped down from the coffin again and was examining her closely. It is certain that there have been many footsteps here, Charlie. As the great unknown let the beam of his lantern slide further over the coffin, a cry of delight suddenly escaped his lips. He had discovered on one side a piece of red cloth, which had been wedged between the coffin when the lid was closed. "Hello, boy. I do not believe that the dead have been buried here in a red robe, which, moreover, seems so new that no moisture has even penetrated. I should like to know if there isn't a strange dead man resting here. We need to investigate that. Are you perhaps scared? But Edward, do you take me for such a hare-heart? Come on, get to work." Raffles had pulled out his tools and was now beginning to loosen the screws holding the coffin lid. From the ease with which the screws could be unscrewed, it was immediately noticed that they had often been opened, and certainly for a short time. Soon the work was over. Both friends grabbed the lid, lifted it, and let it slide to the floor. Then they took the lanterns and lit the interior of the coffin. Raffles burst out laughing when he saw the contents. The head of the coffin, which was divided by a plank, was filled with gold and silver pieces. In the rest of the coffin lay several other metals wrapped in red cloth. On closer inspection, it appeared that these pieces of metal consisted partly of solid gold and silver, partly of gold rings, bracelets, medallions, and so forth, from which the jewels which had been in them for decoration had been taken out. In all likelihood, this stock of metal was destined to be melted together. Charlie had picked up some of the shiny coins and was examining them attentively. Raffles came closer and examined them as well. His keen eye did not fail to notice that he had forgeries in front of him here. So that's the secret of the coffin. It seems to be the treasury of a band of counterfeit coiners. Raffles thought hard again. Now I understand, Charlie, what that voice spoke, which I heard behind the door, and which spoke of flames and sparks. Charlie, meanwhile, had taken out the cloth in which the coins had been. An unpleasant smell came out. "Aha," said Raffles, "that's why the strange hiding place. The cloth is soaked in acid, and this, together with the moist air in the burial vault, should give the coins an old look. The counterfeit money can be of no use to us, but the solid gold and silver can do us good service in our journeys in London, and help our poor friends out of trouble." With an expert eye, the great unknown looked at the pieces and then slipped everything of value into his pockets. When this work was finished, the two friends closed the coffin again. "And now, Charlie, let's find out who this crypt belongs to." They left the room where they had made such important discoveries and found such great treasures. On a stone at the entrance, which was again firmly shut. "Burial vault of the Webster family." "Who is Webster?" whispered Raffles, and the two friends hurried to reach the inn in Inverary, which was about 10 minutes from the churchyard, as quickly as possible. Chapter 7. Fake money. Great excitement at the police station in Scotland Yard. About 2 weeks ago, counterfeit gold and silver coins had come into circulation in the various banks in London. All the dens of thieves, all the known crooks' bars and healers' nests had been searched in vain. The police had spared no effort in tracking down the counterfeit coiners, but all were unsuccessful. The sum of the counterfeit coins in circulation should not have been very large, for no more applications had been received and the general public had long since forgotten the alarming reports. "The devil seems to have broken loose today," swore Inspector Baxter, as he was called on the telephone for the 20th time in an hour. Telegraph and telephone did not stand still today. The officers did not know where to go. Reports came in from Birmingham, Bristol, Plymouth, Hull, even from Dublin into Londonderry that gold and silver coins had again been held, and that everything pointed to the traces of the counterfeit minters pointing to London. The messages came in so great a number that no one knew what to do with them. Such brutality has never happened before. I'd like to know how the gang set it up. They must have made an alliance with the devil. It seems as if they have showered down a rain of counterfeit money over the joint kingdoms. What do you think, Mahone? The addressee seemed to be the only one who had kept his composure in the general excitement. He put the last bite of his evening sandwich in his mouth and said with a laugh, "It's totally indifferent to me for now, dear Baxter, how the fellows have it set up." "Well, you're all indifferent," interrupted Baxter. I've told you 100 times that you have absolutely no aptitude for detective. In a calm tone Mahome replied. I just thought it was far more important to know who the fellows are than how they set it up. At this moment an officer entered and brought a small package addressed to Baxter. Baxter received the package and examined the postmark with great attention. He read the name Edinburgh. He turned the package back and forth thoughtfully. The handwriting looked familiar to him, and yet he couldn't identify it. Finally he decided to open it. In the paper was again a paper, which was tightly tied with a thread. Baxter clearly felt heavy, round objects through the paper. Shaking his head, he cut the thread and opened the second paper. When he had done this, a cry of surprise escaped him. Before him lay 2 gold and 1 silver coins. Baxter pushed the gold pieces aside and unfolded a letter that lay beneath. As he read, his face grew longer and longer. The wrath swelled on his forehead. With a heavy curse he sprang up suddenly and struck the table with his clenched fist so violently that the 3 coins jumped up. Mahome turned in alarm and asked, "But Mr. Baxter, what happened?" He walked back and forth in the office as if stung by a wasp. His face glowed with excitement. "That is boundless brutality. I think I've lost my mind." "But Mr. Baxter, tell me." "Such impudence, Mahome. Such impudence." Baxter took the letter that had been in the package with the coins and read. "The Lord Police Inspector Baxter, London. Much to my great regret, I was often obliged to prepare you all kinds of small disappointments. Today I am so happy to compensate you a little for that. I am sending you attached 2 gold and 1 silver coins. However, this does not represent the indemnity. I would never dare offer it to such a deserving officer. But I have made a momentous discovery for you. These coins come almost directly from the workshop of the band of counterfeit mints, which are presently flooding all England with their manufacture. So I know where to find those villains. I am sorry not to be able to give you any further information at the moment, for I have yet to work in that area myself. I request, however, in 3 days from the post office in Edinburgh to collect a letter addressed to you. Herein thou shalt find precisely marked where to look for the counterfeit coiners. I hope to be of service to you with this, and I remain yours sincerely, John C. Raffles." Baxter had grown increasingly furious as he read. Mahome, on the other hand, clung to the table, almost choking with laughter. Full of fury, Baxter gasped. "What does that stupid laughter mean? You had better try to make that villain, that Raffles, harmless." "Calm, calm, my dear. You must have let him escape a dozen times, no matter how close he was to you. Who can blame me for not getting him? I am almost pleased that the man is fooling us. He must be a witty fellow. Come, Mahome, have you gone mad now? Why? For he leads us on the trail of the counterfeit coiners. I don't believe in that yet. In any case, I will not mind his direction, but leave at once for Scotland. You see, I wouldn't do that, Mr. Baxter. I am sure you will find nothing if Raffles will not. I really hate your rave for Raffles." Grumbling, Baxter sat down at a desk while Mahome, smiling merrily, filled his glass again. Chapter 8. The Ghost. Dusk had already fallen by the time Raffles and Charlie left the cemetery at Inverary. They thus managed to reach the inn without being seen by anyone to erase the traces of the adventure. When he had changed and washed, he said, lighting a cigarette, "Now, my dear Charlie, we must consider together what we can do now to reach our goal. I beg you, Edward, don't risk your life. After all, you have seen today that people there shrink from nothing. Let us leave. Did you ever notice that I've done something halfway? No. I will not rest until I reach my goal. Lest it be noticed that we show ourselves so little, you must go down into the dining room and there first try to find out who the Webster family is, in whose tomb the secret passage opens. In the meantime I'll rest a little and think about what we have to do." As Charlie made his way to the dining room, Lord Lister stretched out on a couch and indulged in the enjoyment of his cigarettes, which he had missed for so long, the cigarettes having become wet in the involuntary shower. He had been lying like this for perhaps 15 minutes, when suddenly he got up in a hurry. He seemed to have made up his mind now. In an instant he had written 2 letters, and he was just closing them when Charlie entered again. "Now, what news do you have?" "The Webster family has lived here for a long time. Now only a certain John Webster lives, who holds the position of valet with Lady Ethel. He is married and lives at the castle with his wife Bessie, who performs porter duties there. John Webster is almost never seen in town. He always seems very secretive, and seems little loved because of his proverbial avarice. John Raffles followed his friend's message intently, without interrupting. Thereupon he spoke in jesting tones. "Charlie, I think I've already made acquaintance with this John Webster. It must have been the man who waited for me at the little gate, and I, too, after the lady's attack on me, I served a little while longer. Saw in the room. In any case, I must act immediately if I want to achieve anything." The great unknown explained clearly to his friend what he intended. He had Charlie pack various items into a small suitcase, making himself unrecognizable through face painting, wig, and beard. When he was disguised, he asked Charlie how the disguise had been successful. "Excellent, Edward. I think Lady Ethel is overwhelmed by the resemblance." "I hope so, and then the desired effect will not be forthcoming. But let us make haste now, that we may leave the house before it is shut." Raffles donned a long black cloak and pressed the hat deep into his face. Charlie also dressed thus, and the two friends left the house, taking the trunk with the various objects with them. It was a moonlit night. Inverary lay in deep rest, and so the friends entered the churchyard unseen. They hurried past it, and soon had reached the sepulchre and opened the gate. Dull blows from a church tower now heralded the 10th hour of the evening. "We must hasten," said Raffles, "if I am to reach my goal today, for we need at least an hour to reach my prison." The heavy stone that served as the entrance was soon removed, and the friends quickly climbed up. A glance at his watch convinced Raffles that it was a few minutes past 11 when they reached the room the evil woman had designated as his grave. Charlie opened the small suitcase which the two had taken and took out a strong rope and a rope ladder. Raffles fastened the rope to the crossbeam which had caused the thrust of the sled. Then he attached the rope ladder to it and pulled her up. Charlie stood with her feet on the rope to prevent it from sliding down and, moreover, held it with both hands. Now John Raffles could easily go up to the end of the slide. When he reached the top, he secured the rope ladder, which now offered easy access. Then he examined the arrangement of the sled. This one was very simple. A weight of about 90 pounds kept pulling the sled up the incline. If, however, she was weighed down by a heavier load, she had to whiz down, and then, when the load was lifted, she would slide back up again. Raffles now, walking slowly downwards, shifted the weight upwards. Halfway through, the sled had to meet him. Then he sat on it and pulled up on the rope that carried the weight. When Raffles reached the top, he lit with the electric flashlight the hatch which he knew led to Lady Ethel's apartments. The hatch was easy to open. He listened. Nothing moved. Raffles took out a fine drill and made a hole through which he could see into the room. He saw the lady sitting at the table. Before her stood an iron box, which she had opened. Leaning her head in her hand, she read in some papers. There was a knock at the door of the room, and Lady Ethel asked, "Who is there?" A voice replied, "It's me, John." The lady got up, went to the door, and pushed back the bolt. John entered. "What do you want?" "Lord Arthur bade you come to him for a moment. He doesn't feel too well." "I'll be right there. I also feel unwell. The sudden appearance of that man has excited me more than I thought. Yes, one gets old. My dream plagues me. I can't shake the idea, John, that our house is in danger of an accident. Have you taken good care of everything?" "Milady can rely entirely on me. He will disturb your rest no more." Raffles, hearing this conversation, involuntarily clenched his fist at these words. Lady Ethel continued, "I am convinced of your faithfulness, yet I cannot shake my fear. I think it's better if I destroy those papers." Just then I read the letter my husband had written to Harry to call him back. I had to intercept the letter if I didn't want to see the wretch I hated enter here as lord and master. But now let me go to my beloved son Arthur. Lady Ethel closed the iron cassette and put it back in the wall cupboard from which she had taken the apparatus and powder. Then she and John left the room. Raffles waited for some time to see if no one came back. Then he opened the lid silently and slipped into the room. He rushed to the cupboard, which the lady had left open, and opened the cassette with a crowbar. He took out a parchment paper, which he had already prepared at the hotel, and placed it in the cassette. Then he went back to his hiding place. He did not have to wait long there when the door was opened and Lady Ethel, followed by John, entered the room. This had to support the lady, who could hardly keep herself on her feet. She sank heavily into an armchair and gave a deep support. "John, what is that? I believe my end is near. That feeling of fear. Shall I send a messenger into town to fetch the doctor?" "No, no. That would cause a stir and I don't want my son to hear that I'm not well. Maybe it will pass again. Tell your wife, John, to go to bed dressed. If I need her, I'll call her. Go now." John disappeared. Lady Ethel turned off the light and went to bed. From the church tower at Inverary 12 strokes resounded through the clear night. Gently the hatch in the wall of the tower room was opened and out emerged a figure, wrapped in a black cloak. Grey hair and a grey beard framed a pale face that seemed to be carved from stone. Silently the figure floated to Lady Ethel's bed and bent over the sleeping one. The lady seemed to be tormented by heavy dreams, for a soft groan escaped her lips. Suddenly, with a cry of terror, she sprang to her feet and stared with wide eyes at the figure standing at her bedside. Ghostly moonlight fell through the windows and onto the man's face. Lady Ethel looked at the motionless figure in rigid horror. "Henry, are you coming to get me?" It came groaning from her lips. The figure stood motionless, like a marble statue. Even the lips seemed not to move when it sounded in the lady's ear with a dull grave. "Yes. I'm Henry. Your hours are numbered. I come to warn you. You have a heavy debt to pay. Do it right away. Otherwise it is too late and you are cursed. In your cassette you will find a letter containing your confession of guilt. Put your signature under it. Soon. You don't have much time. Otherwise woe to you, woe to you, woe to you." Stepping back slowly, the figure disappeared behind the curtains of the bedstead. Lady Ethel had been lying in nameless horror. Now that the apparition was gone, the oppression disappeared. She flew to her feet and pressed the button on the electric bell which was placed above her bed. Half erect she exclaimed, "Bessie! Bessie! John!" A few minutes later the door was opened and the porter Bessie ran into the room, followed by her husband, John Webster. The lady had sunk on the bed. Her breath was heavy. Bessie went to her mistress' bed. "What's the matter, madam?" There. The ghost. Search. John, knowing his mistress's superstitions and fear of ghosts, did not give much weight to these cries, and said, "Madam has a dream. Does madam want to take a powder?" Lady Ethel nodded silently. Bessie had quickly shaken a powder into a glass of water and offered it to her mistress. She drank a little and then spoke in a dull tone. "The ghost of my husband, of Lord Henry, was here. Searches." John shrugged and looked around the room. There was nothing to see. Suddenly the lady exclaimed, "The cassette, give me the cassette." John obeyed. The lady had opened the lock with feverish haste. On top was a sheet of parchment. She glanced at it and sank into the pillows with a deep sigh. The contents proved to her that this was really the confession which the ghosts will required her to sign. In her superstitious terror she was now firmly convinced that that apparition had really been the spirit of the dead lord. "Ink. A pen," she panted. When the request was brought to her, she put her name with a last effort under the document, put it in its place and closed the cover of the cassette. Bessie took the heavy iron box from the sickbed and set it on the table. As she bent over her mistress, she heard her irregular breathing. The lady's lips were blue and cold. Suddenly he straightened up and exclaimed anxiously, "I know, the dead rise again. I'm coming, Henry, I'm coming." With her hand pressed to her heart, she sank back again, and a soft gasp sounded from the lips of the dying. "Quick, John, wake up Lord Arthur. It's coming to an end," insisted Bessie. "I'll go straight to Lady Mabel. We must not lose time." Bessie and John quickly left the room. At this moment the hatch in the wall was opened again and Raffles, who had taken off his disguise, became visible. He quickly approached the table and grabbed the cassette. Lady Ethel opened her eyes once more. When she saw Raffles in the dim light, it seemed to her as if the ghost of her stepson, whom she had sacrificed to death by drowning, had appeared, and with a terrible cry she fell backwards into the cushions. Raffles cast another long glance at the dead man, then muttered, "This is the best. Now you have escaped the earthly judge." He then disappeared with the cassette into the dark hallway. The sled, steered by his skillful hand, carried him swiftly and surely to the spot where Charlie was waiting. The great unknown there opened the cassette and took out the papers which were so important to the real Harry Danby. The father's letter to Harry was also found. Raffles left the rest of the cassette untouched. Though the mission was now fulfilled, he did not feel deeply rejoiced. The sudden death of the lady weighed upon him. The two friends left the secret passage and were soon back at their hotel in Inverary. Chapter 9. At the fake coins. Inspector Baxter had been granted leave by his superior in London to travel to Edinburgh to track down the counterfeit coiners and, if possible, capture the elusive Raffles on this occasion. Detective Marham, with whom Baxter worked in most cases, had been given to him as an aide. The Scotland Yard police station had communicated with the chiefs of police in Edinburgh by extensive telegrams, and the latter provided an inspector and 10 officers, so that Baxter had 12 men at his disposal. The great English and Scottish papers, especially the London papers, reported in lengthy reports that the famous Inspector Baxter was in the process of exposing the great band of counterfeit minters. Indisputable evidence of the origin of the counterfeit money was in the hands of the police. Baxter had already succeeded, by his great cleverness, in establishing that the counterfeit minters were not to be found in London. Further details, however, were kept secret. The whole press agreed, however, that Baxter was due the highest praise. Though the inspector knew that this praise was not really his due, yet he was not a little proud to be the centre of public attention again. On the joint journey of the two officers to Edinburgh, Marham repeatedly expressed his opinion that the journey would be futile. He maintained his once understood opinion that, though they knew the region from which the counterfeit coiners came, they would find nothing if Raffles did not keep his word and directed them further. Baxter, on the other hand, was firmly convinced that with his great acumen he must succeed in finding the right track. At Marham's words, he had only a scornful shrug of the shoulders. "Dear Marham, I am convinced that we will have the gang in our hands within 24 hours. And I am equally sure that this villain Raffles will not escape me again. The fellow is certainly one of the counterfeiters himself, and we shall catch him with all the company. Did you really think I was stupid enough to wait until he got to safety first? I don't believe Raffles has anything to do with the counterfeiters. But what is it then? What new trick is he up to again? Mr. Baxter, I think you are far too furious with Raffles because he has slipped through your fingers so far." Excitedly, Baxter interrupted. "And your fondness for the genius thief, as you call him, has already completely blinded you. Don't get so worked up, Inspector. Remember, John Raffles has always remained the gentleman in all his tricks. He's never pulled a mean prank. He has only ever punished other crooks and spent the greater part of what he took from those people on the poor and needy. Raffles will never become a counterfeit coiner. He only commits crimes to avenge others and help the poor. He's up and up a gentleman." "You're crazy," Baxter growled, and he sat down in a corner. Soon, however, Baxter would sense that Marham was right. He tried to discover something in Edinburgh, but all his efforts were in vain. All caverns and dens were searched, all post offices were closely guarded, as it was believed that in this way it was possible to arrest the man who was to deliver the letter addressed to Baxter. But everything remained without any result. Baxter's excitement had reached its peak. As soon as he came close to Marham he became nervous, for it seemed to him that his face was always in a mocking look. All searches being in vain, Baxter resolved to remain uninterrupted at the station on the afternoon of the third day. It was getting later and later. The letter announced by Raffles never came. Baxter looked around in nervous uneasiness. Marham sat comfortably in a chair by the window and looked down the street. Whenever Baxter passed Marham, he was met with a look of anger. Baxter was indeed angry with Marham for sitting there so calmly, as if the whole matter was none of his business, while he himself was almost bursting with rage. Finally he couldn't contain himself any longer and said, "I don't understand how anyone can be so indifferent." Smiling, Marham turned to him and replied, "But my dear friend, what should I be so excited about? Raffles will show us the right way as soon as the time comes. You don't seem to know that it's 11 o'clock in the evening and still no message has come. The villain has tricked us and lured me to Scotland. Who knows what will happen in London in the meantime? He is afraid of me and therefore wanted me out of the city." Marham smiled maliciously. "Well, Baxter, to be honest, I never noticed any fear of Raffles for you. Rest assured, however, that we will have news before the third day has passed. The man is noble and sure to keep his word. Baxter was about to blow up again when an officer entered and handed the inspector a letter. This letter had arrived from Oban on the last train just run in and showed the postmark of Inverary, the capital of the county of Argyll. "You see, Baxter, I'm right," exclaimed Mahome, laughing good-naturedly. The inspector answered nothing. He opened the letter and read. "My dear Lord Baxter, I am sorry that I have heard you have caused you so much unnecessary trouble. I had written to you that you would hear nothing before the end of the third day. This letter I sent by the last train from Oban. This is necessary, because otherwise in your excessive zeal you would appear here earlier than I can afford, since you cannot be on the spot until 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. Take the first train from Edinburgh and go to Dalmally. From there with an extra postcart through the mountains, until you come to the road that leads almost straight from the Brander Pass to the castle Eaglestone. At the small gate of the castle an old deaf servant will be waiting for you, who will lead you to the lair of the counterfeit miners. Bring a good number of officers with you. But don't make any noise, because then none of your men is sure of his life. The old servant, who alas, as said, is utterly deaf, will surely guide you. I hope to see and speak to you myself tomorrow evening, and I hope to be able to count on your kindness in this instruction. Yours sincerely, John C. Raffles." Baxter had turned pale when he read the letter. He handed him Mahome and said, "The brutality is at its peak. The guy wants not only to see me, but also to speak. He certainly thinks he can escape me too. Just wait, boy. This time I've got you as sure as you're already behind the iron bars." Mahome answered nothing, just shook his head very doubtfully. Since there was no other connection from Edinburgh, Baxter was forced to follow the lead Raffles had given him. At his request, the officers had accompanied him to Dalmally. There the personnel was still provided with 3 men, so that Baxter was now in command of 15 men. At 8:30 in the evening the expedition arrived at the small rock gate. Baxter was the first to reach the gate. When he was about to put his hand on the handle, the door opened and in the dark opening appeared an ancient white-haired man. He was dressed in a loose, caftan-like skirt, and a white, woolly beard hung over his chest. The eyes were hidden behind large blue spectacles. Baxter immediately asked, "Where's Raffles?" The old man looked straight at him for a moment, then he said, bending confidentially to Baxter, "Spoons? No, they make money. I ask where Lord Lister is." "Yes," the old man nodded kindly, "they are beasts." "Are you kidding me?" Baxter exclaimed angrily. Now Mahome and the rest of the officers had approached, who said to Baxter, Calm, Inspector. You have read that the old man is deaf." The old man had read the words from Mahome's lips with intense attention and said with a friendly nod, "Is it theft?" "Of course everything was stolen. Come now, gentlemen, I will lead you." When all the officers were in the dark corridor, the old man closed the street door carefully. Baxter, Mahome, and several other officers had at once lit some electric flashlights to determine where they were and to defend themselves, if necessary, in the event of a possible attack. It was clear as day in the hallway. The old man seemed to believe that the officers wanted to enlighten him, and in a squeaky voice he said, "Thank you, gentlemen, thank you kindly, I see enough already." Leaning slowly on a stick, the old man set out. Baxter in his impatience would have liked to run as quickly as possible, but the old man stumbled forward only in small strides, so that Baxter had to control his impatience. Silently the small group moved on through several corridors. Falling to a whisper, "Go down now, gentlemen, very gently, very gently." He opened the door and the officers saw a narrow spiral staircase, cut into the rock, leading to a horrific depth. The nerves of the officers were tense to the extreme. Each had his burning electric flashlight in his belt, the police baton in the right hand, in the left the loaded pistol. Thus the procession, led by the old man, went down to the depths. Everyone involuntarily counted the steps they descended. There were 235 of them. When they descended the stairs, they found themselves in a small room, but it was large enough to accommodate 8 people. The old man had repeatedly put his finger to his mouth, as a sign that no one was allowed to speak. Now he pointed with a dumb gesture to a door in the right-hand corner of the small room, and indicated by signs that the officers must open this door. A stamping, groaning sound was heard from the room beyond. Now and then the listeners could hear something. Baxter, who had always followed the old man closely, signaled to the officers how they should position themselves. Then he went to the door, laid his hand heavily on the latch, and smashed open the door, which was not closed, with one jerk. The officers standing next to him immediately burst into the room, while the rears hastened to approach. One saw here a rather large subterranean space, which had been carved out in the rocks. In a hearth that seemed to have a smoke outlet upwards, a huge fire was burning. All around were many machines, and on the table all kinds of shapes with metal, and next to it piles of coined gold and silver. When the policeman broke in so suddenly, 3 men were busy at work. Because of the pounding of the machines they had not heard the opening of the door for the first moment. The first to perceive the danger was Lady Ethel's old servant, John Webster, who was about to take a pan of molten silver from the fire. "Betrayal!" he shouted in a louder voice, and at the same time threw a pan full of red-hot metal at one of the police officers who had crowded most of the foreground. High up splattered the metal, which struck the legs of the unfortunate, who roared in pain like an animal, and then sank. The very moment Webster performed this deed, Baxter had fired his pistol, and John, struck in the head, plunged backwards into the hearth fire. When the other officers saw Webster's act, a scream of anger rang out. In an instant they had pounced upon the other counterfeit coins and bound them. Webster's body had slipped from the hearth. His clothes had caught fire. Some of the officers were busy putting out the incipient fire, which meant certain death for all. The old man, who had guided the policeman so surely, now went to Baxter and asked, "Is this letter for you, dear sir? Are you Mr. Baxter?" Baxter nodded, took a letter from the old man's hand, and opened it. He read the following lines. "Lord Police Inspector. I kept my word. You have found the den with the counterfeiters, and besides I have had the pleasure of seeing and speaking to you, for I myself have guided you. John C. Raffles." Baxter's face was twisted with impotent rage. The scales fell from his eyes. Now he knew who the old deaf servant had been. He looked back at him. The old one was gone. There he suddenly saw, right next to the hearth, a small door open which he had not seen before. He understood at once that Raffles had disappeared because of this. With a single jump he was gone. He saw that the door led to a low corridor. "In short," he ordered, "5 men remain here for the wounded, the prisoners, and to put out the fire, the others follow me." His orders were obeyed in great haste. Without looking back, Baxter moved forward into the passage, which, as we know from Raffles's first adventure, split in 2 further on. After a few moments Baxter was at the crossroads. Where should he go now? Meanwhile the other officers had followed him. He determined that half should follow the road that led to the cavern of rock where Raffles had been threatened by drowning. Baxter himself, with some other officers, followed the passage that led to the grave in the cemetery at Inverary. As this corridor was very steep, the officers could only advance slowly. About 1,000 paces away, Baxter suddenly tripped over an obstacle. When the officers lit up with their electric flashlights, they saw Baxter stretched out on the floor. Below him lay, it seemed, an old man. Baxter grabbed the head with both hands to raise it, but he held only the white hair, a grey wig, a fake beard, and an empty coat. With a scream of rage, Baxter flung the wig into the corner. "Escaped again," sounded from his lips. Mahom, who had followed closely behind, could not help but burst out laughing. But Inspector Baxter was not discouraged. He jumped up quickly and hurried further down the hall. The officers followed him and soon the end of the corridor was reached. But there the persecutors faced new obstacles. However quickly Raffles had fled with his friend Charlie, he had not failed to close tightly the exit from the secret passage to the family tomb. At a certain moment the officers did not know where to go. Distraught all stood before the wall, illuminating the damp stones with their lanterns and torches. "The villain can't have disappeared from the face of the earth," claimed Baxter, "so there must be a way out here somewhere." "Wouldn't Raffles have set us up in a trap and gone some other way?" asked Mahom. Furious, Baxter turned to him. His eyes sparkled. With their lanterns. Finally Baxter lay flat on the floor and knocked all over the wall. His efforts were at last successful, but as the inspector had used too much force, not only did the great stone whiz down with force, but the inspector slid through the hole. He let out a loud cry and tried to hold on with his hands. However, he did not succeed, and with a loud thud his body fell on the coffin. The wood could not withstand the blow and cracked apart. Baxter was not easily frightened, but when he saw the coffin shatter, he cried out anyway, for he thought he was lying on a corpse. Great, therefore, was his astonishment when no human bones, as he had expected, but glittering gold and silver coins flew through the room. He had quickly recovered from his surprise and had risen again from his predicament. He called to the other officers to follow him as soon as possible. That went well until it was the turn of the fat Mahome. He barely got through the opening with his legs, but his big belly couldn't get through the opening. So there was nothing left but for the comrades to push the heavy body back up again with great effort. "And such a man wants to be a detective," grumbled Baxter. "I've always said the man is useless." It soon became apparent, however, that Mahome possessed this intellect in abundance, for he lacked physical fitness. He discovered the secret arrangement of the exit, and now the great stone, which actually served as the entrance, came loose. Baxter did not spend long examining the mysterious coffin, but hurried toward town. It did not take long for the police to know that the wanted person was staying at the Hotel the Queen of Scotland. They hastened there at once, but were told there that the great unknown had already departed with his handler. Baxter immediately telegraphed to the Oban railway station. Many hours of anxious tension now followed for the inspector, and at last word came from Oban that the wanted man had not been found. Though Baxter, to his great disappointment, was unable to catch the gentleman thief, the praise of the English press consoled him that he had succeeded in apprehending the band of counterfeiters so quickly. The interrogation of the two surviving counterfeiters revealed that Lady Ethel, who had eluded earthly punishment by her early death, had been the protector of an international band of thieves and counterfeiters. And it also appeared that Lady Mabel, Lord Arthur's wife, had known all about her mother-in-law's work and had even aided her in her criminal enterprise. The women had believed themselves safe in the inaccessible cavern of rock. As disaster approached so quickly, beautiful Mabel was seized with boundless despair. Lady Ethel had exchanged the temporal for the eternal. Mabel was at odds with her husband as ever, as Lord Arthur's noble, upright character was in direct conflict with his wife's vengeful spirit. So who was she to ask for advice and action? She knew that the penitentiary awaited her, and she would not survive that shame. So she seized the last remedy that was left to her and poisoned herself. Lord Lister, of course, had not returned to London, fearing the persecution of the police. He sent a letter from Leith, Port of Edinburgh, to the real Harry Danby, with all the documents and a large sum of money, and stated in it that he intended to disappear from England for some time. Harry had still doubted the good results of the venture, and he could hardly believe his eyes when at last he held in his hands the documents which not only gave him back his good, honest name, but also made him a wealthy heir. Tears of joy rolled down the poor hard-worn boy's cheeks, and in sincere gratitude he kept thinking of Lord Lister, who so generously, once more had in his rights a reprobate of society, a shamefully misunderstood and innocent person. Step, to which he had the full right by birth. And as Harry could now prove that the blemish that had tarnished him for many decades and ruined his life, had rested on him unjustly, he made his way to Eaglestone as soon as possible. Arthur welcomed his stepbrother with open arms. This unfortunate man had in a short time gone from a flourishing, vital man to a stooped old man, for the injustice committed by his mother and wife weighed heavily upon him. Believing that he could not survive this terrible shame, he reached for the revolver in despair. Fortunately, Harry intervened in time to prevent the execution of this dreadful plan. He had experienced well outside, in the great, wide world, that the so-called honor is not preserved because people carelessly play with life, in which there is still so much to make up for. And through lengthy reasoning, he also managed to persuade Arthur to adopt this philosophy. The great trial which had been waged against the counterfeit mints had made it impossible for the brothers to remain in England. Arthur gladly joined Harry, and when the latter suggested that he leave for Australia and establish a large farm there, he followed him with gratitude. The vast knowledge Harry had gained in the most difficult time of his life, when he had struggled with cares, would be of great use to the brothers on the far continent. Arthur had very soon discarded all the allures of nobleman and, like his stepbrother, had become a real farmer. In selling Eaglestone Castle for a good price, the money was used to enlarge the farm. As much as misfortune had haunted Harry before, so richly did fortune blossom for him now. It was as if a heavy mountain had rolled away from him, which had previously paralyzed all his energy, as it were. In time, too, Arthur's memory of the heavy blows that had once been inflicted upon him by mother and wife faded away. He devoted himself entirely to his profession. He had given up the noble name as well as the title and, as his brother, called himself simply Arthur Lydon. The farm prospered beautifully and the products of the Lydon brothers' possessions are now highly valued on the world market. The next issue will contain The Blood Third. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really hoped you enjoyed it. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists, go to pixabay.com. Sheila.